Hi there, my name is Dr. Kelly Clarke, and today I'd like to talk about behavioral assessments within psychoeducational assessments. Psychoeducational assessments are school assessments. They have an academic and an IQ portion to them. Today, though, I want to talk about the behavioral component. So if a student comes to you, or rather a teacher comes to you and says that your child is having difficulties in the classroom that they're concerned about, that's likely what they're attributing to some of their behaviors, is that they might need a behavioral assessment. So if you're noticing in conjunction with the teacher that your child within the home is also displaying behaviors that are just age inappropriate, they're above and excessive to what you notice with your other kids, or maybe other kids that you know in the community, and the teacher is also coming to you and saying that there's difficulties that they're demonstrating that's above most of the kids, you may need a behavioral assessment. So I think an interesting question is whether the behavioral part of it is because there's a behavior problem or there's an emotional problem. I think as parents, most of us have had that fear go through our mind anytime a child tantrums, or say they fall down and hurt their knee and they're crying, what we might consider excessively, is we have this fear come up sometimes that, well, if I coddle them, then they're going to be somebody that's going to be, always complaining as they get older. And so I'm not talking about those kind of normal fears that most parents hopefully don't overreact to. That when a kid tantrums, that my kid is going to be some kind of behavioral terrorist when they get older. Most parents have these concerns, and so at the extreme, I want to talk about let's not let fear overly incite us to do something like a behavioral assessment when it's probably fairly typical behavior. The other side and the other extreme with behavioral assessments is parents will, diminish it, or that it's not a big deal and my kid is like most people. So when somebody comes to you that's a teacher or professional and they're saying, we notice that your child is above most of the kids in the classroom as far as behavioral concerns, we might talk about a behavioral assessment. And back to my point about, is this an emotional problem or a behavioral problem? So kids that demonstrate behavioral problems, one of the features that is different from them than, say, an emotional problem is behavioral problem kids often are disruptive, defiant, argumentative, vindictive. There may be less remorse, say, in their behavior than somebody that has, typical remorse over something. They don't say sorry easily. So kids that have a true behavioral, what we call disorder, might be highly oppositional, anti-authority. They almost get energy from fighting, and they have that argumentative style to them quite a bit. So if you're noticing that at home, and the teacher's also noticing that there is just almost this energy about fighting, arguing, being spiteful or vindictive, getting back at others, holding grudges, conduct problems, rule-breaking behaviors, then we might want to consider that there's a behavioral problem. Also, behavioral problems can be associated with impulsivity and ADHD factors. I've alluded to that in a different video, but also kids that have disruptiveness and impulsive difficulties in the classroom could be mediated by something like ADHD. So in that case as well, we'd look at a behavioral assessment. Now, when we're talking about behavioral assessment, also there's an emotional component. So sometimes kids, unlike adults, will manifest their emotional difficulties in overt aggressive behaviors. So unlike adults, typically when adults have depression, they're thinking about that my life is not that good, or I am not that good, or my future is not that good. Those are some of the factors that often contribute to adults with depression, and they end up isolating themselves, staying at home with their windows drawn down, not going out, typically ruminate that my life is terrible, I'm terrible, my future is terrible. Well, kids don't think like that, not typically like adults. They're more in the moment, their emotions are more immediate, and they don't have that future-oriented type of depressive inclination like adults do. Kids can express their emotions and their sadness and their anxiety more overtly in aggressive behavior. So that's where it becomes confusing. Does my kid have a behavioral problem, or is it an emotional problem that's manifesting into overt aggressive behaviors? So that's the other side, when we can see that it's more led by things like sadness, difficulties interacting socially, not feeling accepted, over worrying, fear of making mistakes, confidence issues, avoidance, not joining group activities, mood dysregulation, and also mood lability, which means their mood changes quickly, easily upset. These kind of things could be more related to an emotional difficulty, including things like anxiety, again, worrying about what others think, fear of making mistakes, constantly fretting about little things. Those are things that can manifest into more behavioral difficulties, but the thing that's leading it is the emotional difficulty. So when we're looking at behavioral assessments, we'll look at, is it a true behavioral difficulty? In other words, they're more anti-authority, more argumentative, they almost seem to get energy out of fighting. And I can remember working with lots of kids that are like that. They can be quite challenging. They're like I said, they almost get energy out of getting a reaction. I remember one kid who was, was telling me that I was way overweight, when typically I'm not somebody that struggles with overweight, just to try to, and used a lot of interesting words to describe me that way, to try to provoke me into a reaction. So kids that want to get a reaction, they enjoy the audience for that kind of reactivity and like to argue, fight, and get into trouble, are more kids with the behavioral difficulties. The emotional side, more of those kids that have difficulties with self-esteem, interacting with peers. They worry a lot, they fret about making mistakes. They have emotional lability, can't regulate or manage their emotions well. Those are kids that have more the emotional component of a behavioral assessment. So when we're thinking of younger kids tend to manifest emotional difficulties like anxiety and depressive features more overtly, so that they can actually argue and be fighting at home, but you'll notice that it's more emotional. They'll clearly have regret, they'll say they're sorry, and they're well connected with you. The kids that are more defiant seem to get energy out of opposing you and breaking rules. Those are the kids that have less of the depressive features and clearly do have more of a behavioral difficulty related to, again, that anti-authority. That's an important thing, where the anti-authority need to fight and argue, almost getting energy out of that, is more related to a behavioral difficulty than, say, it is to an emotional difficulty. By the way, an interesting statistic is that up to 60% of kids with ADHD have been diagnosed with behavioral disorders as well. So anytime that you might know that if your child has difficulties with attention, impulsivity, they may have more of a proclivity towards irritability, snappishness, aggression, fighting, argumentative, and that's where we're getting more into the behavioral difficulty. Again, leading the charge with emotional difficulties, where you might see behavioral challenges, is that these kids have difficulties managing emotions, managing feelings, expressing themselves, are tending to be more isolated, have difficulties with friendships, are more down on themselves, make negative statements about themselves. Those are some of the differences. And as we move through into later childhood, into junior high years or into adolescence, the kids tend to be more isolated, will pull back when the depressive features or the anxiety is higher. So the people with more emotional difficulties tend to be harder on themselves. Those with more disruptive, aggressive, conduct related will be harder on others. So those are some of the distinctions you might want to look for. And if you're noticing in that the home, very difficult to manage, also very difficult for you to reach in and make a connection, and you have concerns about that, you may want to consult with the school personnel, see if they see that as well. Or for more information, you may want to reach out to myself at drkellyclarke.com. Thank you for your time. I'm Dr. Kelly Clarke.